This chapter, chapter 21, covers energy flow and food webs. Now in class, we're going to be talking a lot about energy flow and how energy passes from one trophic level to the other. But in this video, what I'd like to cover, first off, is just an overview of what the different trophic levels are, some definitions of terms, some of which you've probably heard about in the past. We'll also cover food chains, which are how those different trophic levels interact with each other, and food webs, which are more complex ways they may interact. And then we'll end the video with a little bit of a discussion on population regulation, something that we will cover in a fair amount more detail in class. So organisms need to get energy from somewhere. They can't just take it out of thin air. So they need to have a method of obtaining energy. And one of the ways that organisms can gain energy is by capturing solar energy and using it to combine together smaller carbon compounds into larger carbon compounds in the process of photosynthesis. These organisms are what we call autotrophs. So autotrophs are organisms that harvest light or chemical energy and store it as carbon compounds. Now, since autotrophs are the source of food for most other organisms, we call them primary producers, and they will we'll see fit at the base of our food chains and food webs. Feeding on these organisms are going to be organisms called heterotrophs. So all the trophic levels above the producer levels are heterotrophs, and they must gain their energy by eating other organisms. Now, for instance, this squirrel that's eating corn is eating a primary producer, corn. We call this a primary consumer. So primary consumers eat producers. Most primary consumers are herbivores, which are organisms that eat plants and or algae. Organisms can feed on primary consumers, and in this case we would call them secondary consumers. So secondary consumers are also carnivores. Carnivores are organisms that eat primary consumers. Then this naming system goes on further. If you have an organism that feeds on a secondary consumer, we'd call it a tertiary consumer. If we had an organism that fed on a tertiary consumer, we'd call it a quaternary consumer. Now, there are organisms that fall a little bit outside of this primary producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer naming. And these are organisms that feed on items that are not consumed by the next trophic level. So plants that are not eaten by herbivores, herbivores that are not eaten by carnivores, and carnivores that are not eaten by other carnivores. The remains, or leftovers, or the dead tissue is eaten by something called a detritivore. That material as well as waste products from animals is called detritus, and detritus is eaten by a detritivore or a decomposer. Now this can be things like worms or things like fungus or bacteria. So fungi and bacteria form the predominant number of detritivores. And they serve a role of breaking down dead plant and animal material and returning that carbon to the air as carbon dioxide and those nutrients to the soil. Okay. So all of these trophic levels, primary producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, can fit together in a simple relationship called a food chain. So a food chain gives us a depiction of how energy flows. And in class, we're going to talk about what is actually being passed from trophic level to trophic level. But for now, in this video, I'd just like you to see how they fit together. So the plant at the base of this food chain is being eaten by the caterpillar, which is the primary consumer. The primary consumer, the caterpillar, is being eaten by the lizard, and the lizard is being eaten by the snake. So primary producers eaten by a primary consumer by a secondary consumer, and a secondary consumer is eaten by a tertiary consumer. We could also look at this in an aquatic chain with the phytoplankton being eaten by a zooplankton, being eaten by a fish, being eaten by a pelican. So this would be a food chain. Now, in reality, food chains are never what really goes on in nature. Things are a little bit more complex in a real community because organisms can feed on more than one thing. So for instance, this lion is feeding on a zebra, but it's also feeding on the water buffalo. So organisms have many things that they feed on. Oftentimes, also, organisms will be fed on by more than one organism. So therefore, food chain is a little bit too simplistic, and instead we look at communities in what's called a food web, where you can see multiple links between species. Now, we've talked about this in the past, in that not all of these relationships will be the most important, but for this chapter, I just want you to recognize where things fall within this food web. You can see red oak grass here is eaten by multiple things like grasshoppers, harvester ants, topee, termites, and warthogs. And something like a termite might be fed on by aardvark or a serval or a mongoose. Now, you may notice that some of these things can fall into multiple locations on this food web, in that they might be acting as primary consumers, but they also might be acting as a secondary consumer in some senses. So organisms can fall under multiple places in the same food web. So if I look here, I might find that, see, red oak grass is being eaten by a wildebeest that is being eaten by a cheetah. So in this case, the cheetah is acting as a secondary consumer, the wildebeest a primary consumer, and the red oak grass a primary producer. Whereas we also have red oak grass being eaten by the topee, which is being eaten by a gazelle, which is eaten by a cheetah. In this case, the cheetah is acting as a tertiary consumer. The Thompson's gazelle as a secondary consumer, the topee as the primary consumer, and the red oak grass. So a cheetah could act as a tertiary or a secondary consumer, depending on what its prey is feeding on, whether its prey is feeding on another animal or whether its prey is feeding on a producer itself. Okay. Now, something we're going to go into in a fair amount more detail in class, just to make sure that this is a concept that is understood, is one thing that ecologists like to look at is how these food chains and food webs are being regulated and what's most important in influencing the population densities. Now, there's two major things that could influence these food chains and food webs. One is a general class of factors called bottom-up factors. Now, these are things that influence the bottom level, the bottom trophic levels, so the first trophic levels like your plants. And bottom-up regulation means that the quality of the plants or the abundance of the plants influences how many herbivores, and how many herbivores influences how many predators there might be. So the lower levels facilitate the levels above them. Now, communities can also be regulated through top-down factors. These are predators and parasites, things that sit at the top of the food chain, and they limit the abundance of the animals below them, and this can lead to something called a trophic cascade, where changes at the top influence changes in the middle, which influence changes at the bottom. Now, let's look at one very simple 3-species food chain and how bottom-up and top-down could both influence this community. So here's a simple food chain where we have a host plant that's being eaten by an herbivore, the grasshopper, and a grasshopper that's being eaten by a spider. Now, on the left, the purple arrows indicate bottom-up control. So this says, well, what if our host plant becomes more abundant? Well, if our host plant becomes more abundant, then there'll be more grasshoppers. If there are more grasshoppers, this will support more spiders. Conversely, if the host plant becomes less abundant or there's a disease that harms the host plant, grasshopper numbers will decline and spider numbers will decline. So that would be bottom-up regulation. Top-down regulation would be the other way around, which would say that spiders control the level of grasshoppers and grasshoppers control the level of host plants. So let's say there are more spiders, then there are going to be fewer grasshoppers, and fewer grasshoppers means there'll be more host plants. Conversely, if there are fewer spiders, there are going to be more grasshoppers, and if there are more grasshoppers, there are going to be less host plants. So it has a slightly different impact. Now, which one is correct? Well, actually, they both have evidence of this. So here is a study that looked at bottom-up regulation in Florida salt marshes. So what they did, if you look at this graph, these two series of graphs, is they removed parasites, which are the blue bars, or they fertilized, which are the purple bars, or they did both. They removed parasites and they fertilized. So fertilizing increases the bottom, the producer level. Parasite control influences the top. And they showed that if they removed parasites, the blue bars, it didn't really do much to change the community at all. If they fertilized, on the other hand, it had a large impact. And if they did both, it basically did about the same as fertilizing alone. So the community was more impacted by fertilization than it was by parasite removal. Parasite removal had very little impact on the growth of the organisms in that environment. Right? However, we also see evidence of top-down. So here is a small food web where wolves eat elks eat aspen and willow, beavers also eat willow, and songbirds also eat willow. And what they showed is that when they removed the wolves, it had an impact on aspen level. So with wolves removed, the red bars here, they saw decreases in aspen, which is right here, and they saw decreases in willow, and that was then left to decreases in songbirds because they had less food to feed on. Elk numbers, on the other hand, went way up because they had no predators. With high levels of wolves, elk numbers were low, and aspen, willow, and songbird levels were much higher. So changing the wolves, the red bars to the blue bars, being low or high, had an impact on not only willows, but also on songbirds. So wolves impacted those. Now, when we're looking at trophic cascades like this, we see two different types of interactions. Now, wolf directly eats an elk. Elk eats aspen and elk eats willow. So these are what are called direct impacts. Wolves eat elk, elk eat willow. Wolves and elk are directly involved in an interaction. Elk and willow are directly involved in an interaction. However, by changing wolf levels, you change willow levels. You also change songbird levels, even though wolves don't directly feed on songbirds or willows. So this would be called an indirect interaction. So wolves indirectly influence willows. Wolves also indirectly influence songbirds. They influence them through the elk. So wolves directly impact elk. Wolves indirectly impact willow. Okay.